Hi everybody, John here. So yeah, this is going to be my rundown of my top 40 albums from the 1980s. I understand Richard McCook made this video and John's music passion followed up. I don't know if there's been ever other videos doing this, but well, it was quite interesting. I don't normally do ranking videos. In fact, I don't even do any ranking videos. I try and avoid ranking. I find it deeply uncomfortable, very difficult, and yeah, it gives me a lot of anxiety. Anyway, I've managed to pull out 40 albums here that I'm going to talk through, and a couple of caveats before I get too far into it. Firstly, I've decided to concentrate only on albums that I have on vinyl. A lot of great albums from the 80s that I have on CD, but I don't know, it just gets a bit messy, I think. And then, yeah, I'm not including any sort of serious heavy metal. I've got a few sort of metalish, hard rocky type albums on here, but I'm not including anything by, for instance, Iron Maiden or Slayer or Megadeth. I mean, they made some of my favourite albums from the 80s, but I don't know. It just seems to make sense to me that I should filter those out for this video. Anyway, I'm going to get started. Number 40. We've got PIL-Album. Great record. I didn't really listen to it much in the 80s. I certainly did in the 90s, and it's a great record. Very, very intense. Got some very strong tracks, and you can see that Johnny Rotten really wasn't just, you know, a pretty boy at the front of the Sex Pistols. Actually a very, very strong musician. I got this album and listened to it in the 80s and in the late 80s, I think, and it's quite good. There's something very special about the way the vocalist sings, or he almost speaks over the record, really. Not rapping, but it's his sort of style. Great record, really good. It was popular in the sixth form, I remember, when I was younger, and I didn't really get to this until I was actually a student in the back home. Thin Lizzy, talking of Phil Lynott. This is possibly one of my favourite Thin Lizzy albums, I'll say. It's the one with, well, one of two with Snowy White on record, there's Snowy White there. And I don't know, for whatever reason, it barely never gets sort of mentioned, but it's a really good record. Really strong tracks. It's one of those records where you say, you know, there's not a bad song on it. Robert Palmer, Heavy Nova. This was perhaps my first introduction to Robert Palmer, and personally I would say it's sort of a peak in his career. This came out in '88, so it's sort of after the period of Power Station and, you know, his success with Addicted to Love, but I would say it's as a result of those two parts of his career. Really good record, again, very strong songs. I don't think there's a bad song here that I don't like. Well worth checking out if you don't know his work. But one of my favourite bands. Perhaps the majority of their great albums were made in the 70s, perhaps. This was the first of their 80s offerings, and 82's came out. Yeah, again, not one that you really see mentioned very often, but it's a really, really good album. Lots of really good songs. What else can I tell you? Well, Nancy Wilson, Annie Wilson's voice on this is incredible. She's a force to behold, really. So, Imagination, Night Dubbing. I guess technically this is a compilation, although it's not, because it's sort of extended remix versions of some of their big hits. I don't have any other album by Imagination, purely because, I don't know, it's a bit too well, it's not a four-letter word, I know, but it's a bit too disco-y type stuff for me. But I will say that this album was really, really good. A very important one for me in the 80s. My friend, one of my best friends, had a copy of this on cassette, and I borrowed it, you know, at the time of Walkmans. And yeah, really, really good. I've spoken before about how soul, funk music really wasn't sort of my thing in the 80s. It was almost sort of slightly stigmatised in my circles anyway. But this garnered a lot of respect from me, especially. I had to include this because it's just so good. Well, in a similar vein, I've got the 12-inch album, Harold Jones. Technically, I suppose it's a compilation, but it's an album of extended versions and remixed tracks of some of his big songs. To be honest with you, I've never actually had his what was that album that he had called? Pearl and Shell, something like that, the green one. I don't know, but I've never had that. I've only really ever had this one, which is where I know my Trina and Waves. Not very fashionable on VC, are they? I didn't get to this in the 80s. This came to me in the 90s once I'd moved to Sweden. I always remember my first wife, she had this record in her collection, and moving to Sweden and sort of going through some of the, you know, the bits of her record collection. This was one that I really learned to enjoy, and I actually like Katrina and the Waves a lot, purely because, you know, I dared to sort of investigate. They're not sort of a rubbishy pop band. They're certainly not a one-hit wonder. You really got to check out their music and see what they do. This is great. Again, lots of very good, strong songs. Men Without Hats. This was actually one of my first records, I would say, where, you know, I started being a record collector. Quite young. I didn't get this when it came out. It wasn't a record that I sort of, it came out in 82, it wasn't a record that I sort of knew very much about, but the single, Safety Dance, very, very sort of big, popular song. Lots of people know that. It's almost a little bit of a cult classic, I think. That inspired me to look into this band and find out a bit more, and of course their albums were difficult, and this was before the internet, and I remember going around asking record sellers and stalls and shops and things, do you have a copy of this? Because nobody did. One day I eventually came to a record stall on my local town's Saturday market, and asked the man who had the record stall there if he had a copy of this. He said he didn't, but he would keep his eyes peeled and look out, and eventually he did find a copy for me and saved it for me. So it's the first record, I suppose, that I actually sought to collect. This copy that I bought, this one in Sweden, you can tell it's got the Swedish plombierings thing there. David Bowie. A lot of people perhaps would say, how come David Bowie's so low down on your list of 40 greatest albums of the 1980s? I wouldn't say that it's low down. He's actually pretty high, because there's a lot of albums that I haven't included on here from different bands and artists. I ummed about whether I should include this or whether I should include Let's Dance. Let's Dance is a great album, but I've probably played it to death in its time. Let's Dance had a huge big influence on me as a sort of a teenager growing up and sort of burgeoning my interest in music and things, but I think once I found this, and I had this on cassette first of all, it really sort of expanded my understanding of, you know, who David Bowie was and who he could be. You know, there's so much. The Alarm-Decalaration. This is their first album, and it's fantastic. Lots of really good, strong songs. Don't hear much about the Alarm on the VC. I will say that I never knew that I was going to be living in Wales, but now that I do, I always think, wow, Wales is such a great place because they had so many great bands, and the Alarm is one of them. they're often kind of criticised as having ridiculous hair in the 80s, but yeah, some amazing songs, really strong, well-written music. Drama by Yes. So it's come out in 1980. It's quite a different album for them. It's not at all, you know, like anything else that they've done. It would be a mistake to call this sort of neo-prog, but to my ears it sounds like this probably had a large effect on what would eventually go on to become neo-prog. It's sort of shorter songs, less of the sort of the grandeur and symphonic style, but also very great and punchy. Boggles, yeah, they basically were formed this generation of Yes together with members that were there, and that didn't include John Anderson. But you don't miss John Anderson on this. The guy singing does his best to fill that hole, and he does a really good job doing it. Recommend that record for anyone. Love Over Gold by Dire Straits. Again, another band, doesn't get very much mention on the VC. They seem to, yeah, become very stigmatised as well. A lot of people, for whatever reason, just sort of very dismissive of them. I don't know why. Fantastic musicianship. Yeah, I would have kind of included as being progressive rock, but no, a lot of progressive rock channels on the internet don't consider them as prog, but they are way more than just an average rock band, because there's so much complexity in their music and, yeah, incredible playing. They've always been sort of regarded as people that take their the quality of their music very high, very seriously, and it is great, you know. So that's anyway. So next up we've got Pump by Aerosmith, the first American rock album I ever bought. I remember I was a student at the time, and yeah, I lived in Portsmouth, and Love in an Elevator came out, and it sort of really poked up my ears, and I was quite new to sort of hard rock music and heavy metal, and I was curious about this. I remember I'd met a guy in the course who was quite knowledgeable about metal, and so yeah, I sort of felt inspired to catch up, and I used to buy Kerrang at the time. So yeah, great album. Really, it's real sort of teenage testosterone fueled rock music. Steven Tyler, Joe Perry, they do such an amazing job of really sort of capturing that sense of, you know, teenage horniness, I suppose. I can't really put it any other way. Like be a warm-blooded male in his young teens, early 20s, lusting after, you know, company with the opposite sex. It's so well captured in this. The only other band I can think of that do such a good job of really kind of summoning up that is Van Halen. Anyway, next record. Duran Duran, when they kind of took a bit of a split, a bit of a hiatus, split off in two ways. This is one of the ways. So three guys from Duran Duran went in a more sort of synthesizer kind of ambience route. Yeah, I really think that Duran Duran were inspired a lot by Japan, and so I think that they sort of pursued that particular side. So you've got Nick Rhodes, Simon Le Bon, and Roger Taylor on this record. Really good record. When Election Day came out, it was huge to my ears, and the time when it came out was in the 85, 86 time roughly. I hadn't heard anything like it, and it was just phenomenal. Really, really good. Damned. This came out in 86. I think this must have been my first Damned album that came out when I bought it. So I bought it around about that time, 86, and yeah, by this time that it wasn't punk anymore. A lot of people say that they'd jumped on the goth bandwagon. I don't know if I'd agree with that or not, but they certainly attracted that audience anyway. Really good song. Some of my favourite songs on here really are by The Damned. Are just great. You've got In Dual Decorum, you've got Gigolo, you've got Anything, and you've got so many great songs on here. And David Vanian's voice is in superb form. He's got this deep sort of sinister, ghoulish, what would you say, baritone, I suppose, that he uses to great effect in these. Depeche Mode, Black Celebration. Now, it was a school friend that I went to school with, and then later on to sort of foundation college, who was a big fan of Depeche Mode. My friend Daniel sadly died in I think 1996. Anyway, he got me into Depeche Mode, and he was sort of, when I first met Daniel, he was into Depeche Mode, and I was never really a huge fan. But this album on this tour, I think we turned sort of 15 or 16, and we went to London on the train to see them play live at Wembley. It's my first concert ever, and it was completely mind-blowing. I'd never experienced a live concert in a great big arena before. The light show, the volume of the music, and just the whole package was just overwhelming almost. Really, really good time, a lot of happy memories. So yeah, for me this is their highest achievement. Other people have different views, but this is for me the best that they did. Next is Midnight Runner, 2IA. I didn't get to this in the 80s. I think probably sometime in the last decade that I've discovered this record and how good it is. Of course, there was the single from this album, Come On Arlene, huge. I don't know how long it was at number one, but it seemed to be on top of the pops every week for a very long time. And in the 80s, when this was popular, or when this came out, it didn't appeal to me. It wouldn't have appealed to me, but it did grab me later on when I got a copy of this record in maybe 20 years after it came out. And now I can say this is a solid record all the way through. Really good album, and with surprising songs. I'd never really kind of made that connection with Kevin Rowland as being someone into soul and northern soul, and that sort of deep, dark essence in his music that he does so well. It never sort of dawned on me, but listening to this, you can hear really exactly where he's coming from. Sensual World. I did and ah about whether I should include this or the one before, Hounds of Love. Hounds of Love is a really good record. So much so that, I almost had it in this pile. I decided against it and chose this one because I feel this one's more consistent. Hounds of Love, I really like side 2. Side A is it's all very popular and a lot of people like it, but I don't know. I prefer the sort of the long stretch of music that she does on side 2. And this album, I feel I can listen to this from start to finish. Not a bad song on it. It's really good. And I like the ambience. I like the way it starts off with the sound of church bells. Takes me right back to my sort of own childhood. I grew up in a village with a local church that played bells, and it transports me right back to that time. This came out in '89, so it's quite late. But I dug this straight away when it came out. Tin Drum by Japan. I am a huge fan of Japan. I understand this in this list I should choose one album only by an artist or band. I've got Japan, but we'll see a little bit later on. I've also got a David Sylvian album. I consider them being two separate entities, but this is perhaps the last one they did before they sort of split in the 80s, and love them all. I do. I don't. It's hard for me to choose a single album by Japan and say that it's my favourite. I've chosen this one because, well, Richard McCook chose Gentlemen Take Polaroids, which is also a fantastic album, but I like it as much as this. But so here we've got Tin Drum, excellent album by an excellent band. Love everything. Power Station. This is a huge album for me. When it came out, '85, I was a Duranie. I hadn't heard this, and I remember I borrowed a cassette. Some chap at school had it on cassette, and I borrowed it from him, and it was just amazing. I had to have that album. Yeah, at the time, you know, to my ears, my child's ears, my teenage ears, this was sort of really hard and heavy and raucous. I listen to it now, and it's not that at all. It's pop rock, but at the time it was, you know, blasting, and it introduced me to T-Rex. I've never heard of T-Rex before, and yeah, they do the fantastic cover of Get It On, and yeah, brilliant album, so good. And also it brought my attention to this guy. What was his name now? Tin Machine. Yeah, I'm wondering if I should have put this one a bit further in. When this came out, again, it was you know, completely groundbreaking. A lot of music that I think David Bowie had been doing in the 80s was, you know, fairly mediocre. It wasn't great stuff, was it? He did that Tonight album. He did the Never Let Me Down album. I saw him on that tour, and it was, I don't know, all of it safe, without any particular direction. It was big news when he was sort of forming this band and having interviews and saying, he was saying how, you know, we look forward to being part of a band, a group, rather than a sort of being the spotlight. But of course he was the spotlight, and they booked a few really sort of small gigs and things in places secretly, and yeah, had a great effect. I think this album is so much better than the one that came out after it. It's so raw, raucous. They're still taking chances, and they pay off. They really do. Why they didn't follow through with another great one, I don't know. But there you go. Fantastic record. Simple Minds. Another big music band. Yeah, this one is not necessarily the popular one with the Simple Minds fans. It's really sort of their big sort of commercial hit record. It's got Live and Kicking on it, I think, and yeah, it's sort of the one that, yeah, songs were being played on as background music on American films, and it got them a lot of attention. Everything they'd done up to this point were, yeah, all the songs were, you know, a lot more independent sounding, a lot more robust, whereas by this time they were making sort of music that people might want to hear on the radio, but it's still a really good record, I think. I can't say. Okay, so now we're getting into the serious end of my top 40 80s albums. Right, next is Clannad-Legend. This was essentially a soundtrack album, if you like, to a TV series. I never did see it. I always caught sort of, you know, trailers for it on the television, but I never did see the series. I'd heard this theme music, Robin the Hooded Man, and quite liked the sort of the soft, I don't know what you call it, sort of the soft feel to the production of that. And well, yeah, I started looking into Clannad, and of course they've got a lot of great records. And I first bought this on CD, and it was one of my very early CDs actually, and I loved the whole sort of, you know, the idea of it was top quality sound and all that sort of stuff. Only recent years found this on vinyl, so I'm very glad to have it on vinyl. Really good record. Next up we've got Haircut 100 Pelican West. Not a record I see very much on VC. I really like it. I like the sort of the really fast speed rhythm guitar sound they've got going. You say what you like about them, they're a serious band. You know, these aren't just sort of kids in a pop band. These are serious musicians. And this record is really good. I think they could have been a really big, much bigger band than they are, or, you know, that they're remembered for. But I do know that after this album, Nick Haywood, who's the guy that essentially the leader of the band, songwriter, lead singer, all that sort of stuff, he had some sort of a breakdown and ran away out of the studio when he couldn't sort of handle all the pressure that was on him. He was only a young lad at the time, and that really was the end. I think they made another album after this without Nick Haywood, but yeah, it was nothing. It doesn't even. I don't know if it's ever been repressed or whatever, but anyway, so that's the next one. I've been struggling to sort of work out where to place this. U2, I'm not really a fan of U2, but I can't fault this record. This is such a great album. I've got most of their catalogue, and I will say that this really is pretty much the only one I actually quite like. You know, in fact, I don't quite like it. I actually really like it, and in many ways, it was sort of the soundtrack to the period of my life when I was studying again in my sort of foundation course, about 87, 88. Yeah, it is surprising that I don't really like much U2 other than this, but I do really rate this very highly. I was sort of friends with a couple of lads that were in a band at the time, and were like me. They were big fans of Duran Duran, but they used to make, you know, cover versions of some of their favourite songs, and they did a cover version of a track on here. What was it now? In God's Country, and I thought that was really impressive. I later on became sort of a member of that band, and I remember the day before I passed my driving test, I had been on stage with them and played in a local hall, and yeah, if anyone's ever performed on stage in a band or at all, you know, you're going to get a real kick from that. There's no way that I was going to fail my driving test after that. But yeah, some memories I have with Rush. This, I think, was the first Rush album that came out after I had gotten to know Rush. I was familiar with Moving Pictures and the other one, I can't remember what it's called now. I want to say it's called Permanent Waves, but I could be wrong. I think it's Permanent Waves. So yeah, they were sort of out and about, and so I sort of learned to know those later on. But this was the one that came out, if you know what I mean, once I knew who they were. Again, another one that I got as a student in Portsmouth when I lived there. And I must say, I think this is perhaps one of my favourite Rush albums, if not the favourite one. Doesn't get a lot of love, does it? Rush fans don't hold it in very high regard. I don't know why. I just think it's brilliant. I really, really like it, and I like it much more than anything else that they've done, pretty much. It's the one album they did in the 80s after they'd sort of had this very sort of heavy synthesizer thing, Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, that sort of thing. With this, they kind of get back into the much more guitar in the mix, and I think it works really, really well. Budgie. Yeah, my favourite Budgie album of all, I think. Again, this is another album that I'd learned to like in Portsmouth. Funny, it was such an incredible time for me, I suppose. I never really thought about it until now. But I had this on cassette, and I picked it up, and I don't know, at the time it didn't really appeal to me because it wasn't really my thing. And but then I started to kind of get into heavy metal. I sort of discovered Motorhead and yeah, that sort of thing. And I remembered, oh, I've got that cassette somewhere. I should go and dig it out and listen to it. And yeah, I haven't looked back. I really do like Budgie. This is an incredible record. I think you can really hear the roots of Iron Maiden in this. You know, I'm not saying that Budgie is the only band that sort of was sort of the influence of Iron Maiden, but I really do think you can, if you listen to this, you can hear that Iron Maiden have been listening to it too. The Blow Monkeys, Animal Magic. It's their second album. I first got this on CD as well in the 80s, and I can't remember why. I just know that I think my sister saw them play live at a concert once or at a festival or something, and that's where I would have heard the name, and then I sort of saw the CD and sort of thought, oh, that's a name I know, and picked it up. And it is actually one of my favourite 80s albums, as you can tell. I'm getting closer to the end now. They're quite a unique band, I suppose, in that, yeah, they've got a very certain twang in the guitar sound, but also they've got a lot of brass, and Dr. Robert here, an unusual vocal, quite a comfortable vocal. I like to listen to what he sings about, but his inability to say his R's, it's sort of like a Jonathan Ross or Jonathan Wass, where he, I don't know what you call that. It's this kind of certain kind of speech impediment, isn't it? But yeah, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of soul on this record. At the time when I was getting into this, I didn't know anything about soul, but now when I listen to it and I'm learning to appreciate soul in recent months, I suppose, almost, I can hear a lot of things in here that had gone over my head in the 80s. Misplaced Childhood by Marillion. This is a concept album, favourite album by Marillion, and I often think of this as being one of the only, or perhaps the only album that I have that can actually bring a lump to my throat. There's something very, very clever, or very special, the way the music flows in this. I remember when Kayleigh came out, which is a single on this album. It wasn't my thing. I was a sort of Duranie at the time, and I really didn't enjoy it at all. And then eventually I did get this album, and yeah, Kayleigh all of a sudden made a lot more sense, because you hear it in sort of the in reference to what's going on for the rest of the record here. Concept album, all about, I think it's Fish, talking about his childhood. But yeah, there's a lot of musical passages in here, and they, I don't know, they're so well written, so well put together, that it kind of wells up this sort of sense of emotion, and it does give me a big lump in the throat sometimes. Not always a sad lump, sometimes even a happy lump. I think, yeah, I don't know which part it is. Well, I wouldn't say which track it is, but there's particular tracks towards the end of this album that really sort of, work very well as a sort of an emotional carriage, I suppose, for the record. Really good album. Here I've got Whitesnake, Slide It In. Yeah, perhaps my favourite Whitesnake album, certainly the favourite one in the 80s. This is the one that they did before they did the big MTV smash hit, the 1987 album. And there apparently are two versions of this. This is the original UK version, with Mickey Moody playing guitar and Colin Hodgkinson on bass. David Coverdale went to America, and they were going to publish this in America, but they wanted it to be remixed. And in the midway, David Coverdale had fallen out with Mickey Moody and dismissed him from the band, and brought in perhaps more attractive people like John Sykes, who and also he got rid of Colin Hodgkinson and brought in Neil Murray playing bass. I think, quite obvious, David Coverdale was building up his sort of, attractive band in order to make videos on MTV, and that's what he did. And so the American version of this album, I think, is a lot more sort of metal, whereas this is still firmly blues rock. I really like this record. Lots of innuendos in here, very typical Whitesnake. In fact, I said earlier on in this list about Aerosmith, in that album that I showed, Pump, how they really do muster up this sense of being a horny teenager. Well, David Coverdale does a pretty good job of that himself, and this Whitesnake album is real sort of cock rock. It's a horrible phrase, isn't it? But it is. That's what it is. Matt Bianco, whose side are you on? It's a record that I've had for quite a long time. I wasn't wasn't specifically a Matt Bianco fan or anything like that, but I think I even had a second record by them as well. Although where that is, I've no idea. I listened to it and really kind of fell in love with this backing singer, her voice, and what she brings to the songs. There's a very sort of Latin quality to this record, and the lady Basia, who does the backing vocals, I believe she's actually Eastern European. She's not, she's not Latin at all, but she does a fantastic job with these songs, and she seems to be able to sort of take them to a different dimension somehow. I understand she left Matt Bianco after this record, and sort of did solo work. I've heard her sort of one of her solo albums, and I was particularly unimpressed. It wasn't really anything in the vein of this. So I don't know much more about her than that, but so next up, ABC, Beauty Stab. I think many people perhaps would have chosen the first album by ABC, and that is a very, very good one, and I do hold it very highly. But I think I've always really liked this one purely because it's quite audacious, It's a very different record from the first one. They don't try and make what was that first album called? Lexicon of Love or something like that. They don't try and do that part two. Instead, they do something quite different. Stripped down to a 3-piece, and it's a very raw record. Got a very loud production and a very sort of raucous, hard edge to a lot of the songs. There's I always think certain albums you can sort of fit them back to back on a C90, and I always think that this would really complement David Bowie's Ashes to Ashes album, because that's got sort of Carlos Alamar's a very loud guitar, and the production on that album is quite loud, and it's similar to this. Martin Fry isn't quite as shouty as David Bowie, but he does raise his voice a bit. Anyway, really worth talking of loud rock music. Yeah, this one has to be in here somewhere. I haven't included any sort of real sort of heavy metal as such in this list, not because they don't fit, but I just feel that it would make it too complicated for me. But AC/DC, they're just a hard rock band, aren't they? And this is perhaps their finest moment. I don't really need to say anything more about that, except... And on a similar vein, the Cult Electric. I've always loved this record. Yeah, I've said before about how in this you can really hear the Led Zeppelin influence, and a lot of people scoff and say, surely you mean AC/DC. Some people feel that this is very much sort of like an AC/DC rip-off type record. I don't see it like that. I think that they're reaching further back, and I hear, for instance, the first and second Led Zeppelin album very much in this, and Jimmy Page is very sort of stripped down, no nonsense production. That's what I think you hear in it. Of course, it was a modern record for its time, so yeah, perhaps it does sound more sort of like a broader guitar sound, like you might find in an AC/DC, for instance. But Ian Astbury, here's a good example. Ian Astbury, he says "baby, baby, baby" in this too many times for it to really be anything like an AC/DC record. I think he's probably got more in common with Robert Plant while he's doing that. Anyway, brilliant. It Bites. Love that. Big Lad in the Windmill. In a similar situation, I like everything that they've done, at least with Francis Dunnery as the singer. This is their first album. I've always really enjoyed this. I remember I borrowed it from the library the first time, and I liked it directly. I think probably because they're hard, well, at least in the time they were quite hard to pigeonhole, and I think whoever they were signed to, Virgin, had a hard time sort of marketing them, because they weren't really rocky in terms of being hard rock or anything like that. They weren't poppy enough to be considered like a pop band, like Duran Duran or anyone like that. Instead, they're actually sort of very accomplished musicians with very complex songs, really well written songs, and they just didn't sort of seem to sort of fit any particular mould, I think. The reality is essentially they're a progressive rock band. But when they were making this progressive rock, this came out in, I can't remember when, but when it did come out, progressive rock wasn't really a thing anymore. It was a thing of the past. And these guys obviously had an ear cocked to what had happened in the past and enjoyed it, and based their music on that. If you like prog, and perhaps prog, it's a little bit unusual, but out of its time, then this is a really good record. I recommend it. Really good quality songs. David Sylvian. Many of his records I could have put in here, but I've chosen this one. It's one of those records that I've played so many times. Like I know this back to front. Some beautiful music on here. I really like David Sylvian's voice. I like the songs that he writes. I like the way he selects, the people that he's going to have playing on his music. He's a real sort of musician's musician, and beautiful record cover, and a beautiful album. Very atmospheric. Sadly, his releases are a bit hit and miss, because he can be a little bit sort of abstract, and some of his albums can be difficult to kind of get along with, but this isn't one of them. This is perhaps one of the most accessible ones. Talk. Yeah, you may have seen my recent video that I made, 6-track sampler as a competition entry, and Talk. This has to be my favourite album by them. It's the middle one, so it's not the first or second, it's the third. that went on to affect, I believe, the fourth and the fifth album. And it's, I think that cover says a lot. It's sort of very dry sounding, autumnal type record. It's got those sort of autumnal colours there, and the songs are very much in line with that. You know, they're very, I don't know, you wouldn't dance to this record, for instance. It's definitely a record to listen to. Down to the last three. So here we've got Prefab Sprout, and this is Steve McQueen. Brilliant record. Got 2 copies of this in this cover. I really like Paddy McLuhan's songwriting, and I don't know if I like Wendy Smith. Her backing vocals are just, you know, for me they're just dreamlike. I love them so much. I saw them play live once at the Guildhall in Portsmouth, and you know, I was right there in front of the stage trying to catch the eye of Wendy Smith, and yeah, I actually did manage to catch her eye, and she smiled at me, and that's sort of one of those things that I still tell the story today. And this was, you know, well, must be going on for 30 years ago now. But anyone that doesn't know this record, you know, you really got to look into it. It's marvelous. One of my favourite albums of all time, let alone the 80s. Number 2, Dream Academy. What can I tell you about them? Again, in a similar thing. I really like the backing vocals. This is Kate St. John. She plays the clarinet and the oboe, and she also in the Dream Academy she also provides backing vocals, and I think they really sort of have a large part in taking those songs to a beautiful place. Nick Ladd-Close is the main vocalist. A very good songwriter. He's worked alongside, you know, people like David Gilmour, and written for Pink Floyd and that sort of thing. Beautiful record. The next album after this is also very, very good. I could sort of change them out, I think. And the third album is well, spectacular too. They have a very dream-like quality to them. I like the themes that they sing about, and I like the way they do it. And my number 1 album from the 1980s is Rio by Duran Duran. Duran Duran were amongst, you know, the first bands that I discovered, got into at a very early age. There was obviously a connection between David Bowie and Duran Duran. I could hear that already in the 80s. So this came out in 82, but I don't think I would have heard it until 84, I guess. And yeah, it's just an album that it never stopped sounding good to me, and I guess I got very distinct memories of listening to it and just losing myself in the music, in the atmosphere that it produces. And the whole production is a very sort of, for me it's a very sort of soundscapey type production. There's a lot of depth in it, and there's something about it, it just takes me away. I learnt to enjoy reading along with this. I always remember I read the Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe series, all the I think it was 7 books, and yeah, I read them, and this was the soundtrack to those books while I was reading them, and yeah, for me that just sort of cemented this album in my being of everything. And now whenever I hear this, I imagine being on horseback galloping through a forest in Narnia. You know, it seems to kind of really bring those memories, but also those feelings up. So many great songs on here, lots of good singles, but the album tracks in many ways probably like them more purely because they don't get played so much, but there's not a bad track on here. It's a fantastic record. They went on to make other records after this, but I don't think they ever really topped this, in my opinion. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's my top 40 records of the 1980s. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Bye.